So good afternoon and welcome to this lecture by one of the great scholars of the work of Giovanni Battista Piranesi, Andrew Robison, the Andrew W. Mellon Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery, Washington, and an admired colleague of mine. Thank you all for coming in the snow. I'm Suzanne Borsch, the Robert L. Solly Curator of Prints and Drawings here at the Gallery. And this lecture is given in relation to the special exhibition meant to be shared, selections from the Arthur Ross collection of European prints, which is on view on both the first and fourth floors of the gallery. The Arthur Ross collection, excuse me, which was donated to Yale by the Arthur Ross Foundation toward the end of 2012, consists of over 1,200 superb European prints, perhaps 800 of which are from 18th century Italy, including well over 600 by Piranesi. Arthur Ross was a classicist and he loved Rome, and among many institutions that he supported, although most were in his native New York City, he and his wife endowed the library at the American Academy in Rome. In the collection, there are also about 200 prints by Goya, smaller numbers by some of the great French artists of the 19th century. We are honored to have here in the auditorium Janet Ross, Arthur Ross's widow, who made the trip from New York, despite the snow. Janet, Janet, would you raise your hand? Thank you, and we thank you and the foundation again. Now, Andrew Robison did his undergraduate work at Princeton. He finished summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa with a focus not on art history, but on philosophy, religion, and classics. He went on with his studies of religion at Oxford and then had a Fulbright to study in India. He completed his PhD back at Princeton, still focusing on philosophy and religion. In 1970, he began teaching philosophy, but also the history of graphic art. And only 4 years later, in 1974, the National Gallery of Art had the perspicacity to choose Andrew to be curator and head of the Department of Prints and Drawings. He has held that position ever since with enormous distinction. As early as 1970, Andrew began publishing on Piranesi. His long bibliography includes, if I've counted correctly, 10 important publications on Piranesi, including in 1986, a catalogue raisonné, which if anybody has done a catalogue raisonné, you know it's a very long, complex thing to do, of Piranesi's early architectural fantasies. And actually, I just learned at lunch that the curator of the Arthur Ross collection called Andrew's work the Bible. But of course, as head of prints and drawings at the National Gallery, Andrew could not focus on Piranesi only, and among his nearly 50 articles or catalogs are some on Dürer, early German drawings, Rembrandt, Venetian art of the 18th century, Goya, Munch, Kirchner, Picasso, and some more general topics, as well as over 100 reviews of books and exhibitions in professional periodicals. It should be stressed, though, that as curator, Andrew can by no means spend all his time on research and writing. A larger and fundamental part of his job is to build the collection of prints and drawings for the nation, and he has done this truly brilliantly. This activity has been celebrated in overview exhibitions beginning as early as 1978, a large exhibition in 1991, which was the 50th anniversary of the National Gallery, others in 97 and 2000, and Andrew right now is working on an exhibition to celebrate the donations of Paul Mellon on the 75th anniversary of the National Gallery. And also, all through these years, Andrew has retained his philosophical turn of mind and has published reflective essays on the nature of and reasons for collecting. Now, I must stop and let Andrew get to the podium. Let me just say, as a practical matter, those of you who have seen the exhibition will know that some of the Piranesi's are on the first floor, a small group of the famous Carceri and some of his groteschi, and that a much larger number, the actual topographical prints, the veduti and the archaeological works, and those actually are the least known aspect of Piranesi's oeuvre. All of those are on the fourth floor. And the catalog of the Arthur Ross collection is for sale in the lobby with a 30% discount for those who attended this lecture. Andrew has kindly agreed to take questions from the audience after the lecture. And with no further ado, I will turn over the podium to Andrew Robison, who will give us his lecture with his intriguing title, The Marriage of Venice and Rome, or What Makes Piranesi Great. Andrew?
Watch the step there.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Susie. We're old friends, so, we can use nicknames. But perhaps I should be more formal in this context. Anyway, I'm sure that many of you, to different degrees, already know a fair amount about Piranesi. And when Suzanne asked me to give this lecture, I didn't particularly want to do another standard run-through of his biography or his works in a sort of chronological order, that sort of thing, which are easy to find in numerous publications. And so I thought what I should do this time is something a little bit different. Perhaps some of you know this great 1956 collage by Richard Hamilton, my favorite, which is titled by the artist, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing? And even though this is not the Venice or the Rome that I'm going to talk about, I thought it made a good introduction. Because what I do want to talk about is what makes Piranesi great. This, of course, is a very old-fashioned idea that you can distinguish great artists, great works, minor works, and so forth. It's one that has been much debated philosophically, primarily in academic art history departments, but still, I think what I want to focus on is kind of treating the general question, if we wanted to say that a particular artist was a great artist, Rembrandt or whoever, Piranesi, Picasso, other than just saying that they have always thought to be a great artist by many people who know what they're talking about, how would we try to establish that? Here comes my philosophy. You see, if you were challenged, what would you say to try to establish that an artist was a great artist, besides just saying everybody thinks so? And because I want to try to deal with the components of Piranesi's art, the visual components, and start with very, very straightforward ones, and then work my way up towards more advanced, more tricky kinds of discussions. Now, Piranesi, throughout his life, and I've already given you the answer, right? The marriage of Venice and Rome, that's the answer. But you have to get the details, right? Devil's in the details. Then you got to see, well, what really is this about? Throughout his life, Piranesi made fantastic drawings. I'm currently working on a catalog raisonne of his drawings, and he had about 5,000 when he died. There are about 600, 700 that survive. But his drawings were not just in preparation for other works. He made drawings which were highly finished works for sale or for gift. This is one example in the National Gallery, done about 1750, this amazing architectural interior. And, of course, in his maturity, he did a lot of very real scientific archaeology. He was not an armchair archaeologist. He's someone who actually went into the field, dug, tried to reconstruct, figure out how were these buildings built, who built them, how did they build them, and so forth. And then in his midlife, he designed 2 architectural projects. Only one of them was built. This is the facade for Santa Maria Priorato on the Aventine Hill, which he rebuilt. He didn't build it from the beginning, but he did rebuild it. And then later in his life, he designed some wonderfully wacky and eclectic interior elements, fireplaces, furniture, mantelpieces, and so forth, drawing upon many different aspects of Mediterranean culture, not just Italian. And then late in his life, in the 70s, he restored some antiquities. This was the period in the 70s, 60s, 70s, right through the end of the century when stuff was coming out of the Villa Adriana. Gavin Hamilton, many other visiting signori were excavating. And of course, this is the time when the temples in the south, Paestum, Pompeii, the city of Pompeii, Herculaneum, were being excavated. And so you had an awful lot of material coming out of the ground, including very beautiful material. It's certainly the most active period of finding Roman antiquities since the 16th century. And a lot of this material was broken. A lot of it needed to be restored. And sometimes the restorations were a little bit fanciful. So this wonderful, this wonderful candelabrum, which Piranesi put together out of various bits of antiquity, real bits of antiquity, which were then finished up by, probably by his good friend Cavacepi, who was a restorer, sculptor restorer, and made into an elaborate, very large candelabrum. This one is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It was bought by Mr. Newdigate on his trip to Rome, bought 2 of these things, took them home, and then eventually gave them to Oxford. All of these things, and his theoretical writings, are interesting, they're important, they're very much an aspect of 18th century culture. But if we want to talk about what made Piranesi great, then I have no doubt that it's his prints and his books. Then, as now, by far the most important were his views of Rome, his fantasies, like the Carceri, and his archaeological work, like the Antiquità Romane, 1756, which brought him to international attention and led him to be made a member of the Royal Society of Antiquaries in London, which he was very proud of. So to specify what are the aspects that make Piranesi great, I'm going to talk about 7 aspects of his prints and books. Here comes philosophy again. You know, just keep count. You'll see where we are in the lecture. And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I'm going to begin in the context of Roman printmaking, of views and architecture, and ask that question again: what is so different? What is so appealing about Piranesi? And to begin, as in philosophy I was an empiricist, so just facts, ma'am. You know, let's get to the theory later. We'll start with very basic aspects, and a very basic measurable aspect is size. Size. You can measure it with a ruler. So, Piranesi's first etchings in the 1740s, he made for other publishers. He wasn't able to keep the copper plates, he was so poor. And those, like this view of the Mausoleum of Hadrian across the river, were very small, 5 inches by 10 inches. Then, slightly later, he started making his architectural fantasies with a series called the Prima Parte, and they were about 3 times as big, so running roughly 10 by 14, 10 by 16. A normal folio size. And this continues a tradition in Rome, beginning with Duperrac, and we were talking at lunch about the speculum, other artists who contributed in the mid-16th century, some of the earliest views of Rome in a series. This is Duperock, 1575, 8 inches by 15 inches. Then we jump 100 years to Falda in the 1670s, same size, 10 by 16. And then to Piranesi's teacher in etching, Giuseppe Vasi, in the mid-1740s, so just before Piranesi starts to work, 8 by 13. So this is a long tradition, 200 years, of views of Rome in this kind of size. After his first works, Piranesi went home to Venice in 1745, and he stayed 2 years, till 1747. Comes back to Rome, and immediately, from the very, very first, his prints are twice as large. The Groteschi, the first prints he made when he got back to Rome, are now double folio in size. The Cartri, likewise, and his very first views of Rome, likewise. So immediately, he's totally changed. And it won't surprise you that I'm going to say the reason is his experience in Venice in those 2 years. In his later vedute, Piranesi even went up to 20 by 28, these very giant views of Rome toward the end of his life in the late 60s and 70s. Venetian tradition of printmaking with views of cities, of course the city of Venice primarily, began really at the beginning of the 18th century with Calaveras. His prints were also single folio size, they were small. But in 1720, the first real survey of views of Venice was published by a publisher named Lovisa, Domenico Lovisa, and they are 15 by 20, 14 by 19. They are this double folio size. And likewise, the very first survey of a Venetian building, the Basilica of San Marco, published in 1728 by Visentini, and same thing, 18 by 27. So by the time Piranesi gets to Venice, this larger size view has taken hold. So Marieschi in 1741, Canaletto in 1744, they're working in this double folio size, as you can clearly see in the exhibition upstairs, where there's a nice series of Canaletto etchings. Okay, here comes the objection. Yes, there are a few larger format views published in Roman printmaking. There are a lot in British printmaking and French printmaking, but extremely rare in Rome. Very, very few. Probably the only one that had any influence on Piranesi was just 3 prints published by Vasi of the Palazzo Caprarola, which are in this double folio size. The timing of Piranesi's beginning this, 1747, tells us very clearly it came from his experience in Rome, 45 to 47. Now, yes, there are a lot of big paintings of Roman exteriors and interiors. Here's a Panini, which is in the gallery, and you've got nice Panini on view here in the ground floor. This is the Pantheon. This is before Piranesi started. This is 1734. It's 40 by 50 in size. And you might say that Piranesi had in mind to challenge painting with his prints. So it's a nice comparison, isn't it? The interior of the Pantheon, the interior of the so-called Tempio della Tossa, and with a similar treatment of a round interior. And because, in a way, Piranesi was challenging paintings with his printmaking, that's also why his prints were immediately framed, glazed, and hung. A lot of records in Rome, in England, in France and Germany, of Piranesi's in the 18th century already being taken out of their books or separated from their portfolios and framed and glazed and hung. Indeed, they're some of the first prints for which this was done regularly. So, second aspect of why Piranesi is that his decision to go up in scale had an immediate effect on Roman printmaking. 1763, Jean Barbeau, Rome Moderne, publishes a series of views of Rome which are just so, where are we? Clearly based on Piranesi's views of the same images. And so since the composition is based on Piranesi, we can say absolutely the size, the use of this new size. And that continues all the way through the 18th century. Vasi does some bigger prints, Francesco Panini, ending up with Luigi Rossini at the beginning of the 19th century. So Piranesi transformed the sense of size in Roman printmaking in views of archaeology, views of architecture, views of the Roman landscape. Now, clearly related to size is a second element where Piranesi was so different from contemporary Roman printmaking, and that is scale. One always has to remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about scale. So scale and size are very different. But let's start over again in the 16th century. There we go. Duparak, the Isola Tiberina, 1575. Then here comes, 100 years later, Falda, the garden of Cardinal Peretti, and then finally Vasi, image of the Pantheon. Now, what's, I think, characteristic of these views in terms of scale is that all of them show the buildings sitting rather tidily in the middle ground, pushed into the background so you can see it all the way around. They're not too far back to see the details, but they're not right up in your face and so forth. But with Piranesi, regardless of the size of his prints, his buildings are always in scale giant. Giant. And they soar. They flare. They explode upward and outward, both in his fantasies, like this one from the Prima Parte, and in his views, like the Ponte Solario. In fact, in this case, the bridge is so big in the picture space, to use a good Meyer Shapiro modern terminology, in the picture space, that the space is not big enough, so the upper bit of the crenellated tower breaks the borderline, as if the space is not enough to hold this thing. It's breaking right out, actively, almost like an organic movement. Naturally, Piranesi's sense of scale is based on a deliberate use of perspective. Above all, I won't say Venetian, but let's say North Italian traditions of stage design. To my utter delight, you have on view in the exhibition exactly what you need to have, which is Ferdinando Bibbiena's, congratulations, Suzanne, Ferdinando Bibbiena's treatise in 1711 to show designers how to make theatrical designs look bigger, make the space look bigger, by showing the images from an angle, not head-on, and using perspective to create a sense of magnificent scale. So you see them from an angle, you see them from below, and that's exactly what's happening, of course, in the Ponte Solario. You're seeing it from an angle, and you're seeing it from below. And this treatise explains to novices how to do that, how to paint those stage flats. You got to do this and this and this. This is all the geometry of it in the foreground. This approach quickly infected Venetian printmaking. And so back to Mr. Marieschi in 1741, view of the Piazza San Marco, or Canaletto, view of the library on the Piazzetta. You can see exactly what I'm talking about. Seen on an angle, not from the front or the side, seen on an angle, and seen from below. Both of those are very, very important. And again, for Piranesi's distinctive quality, I think we can look to the Venetian background. But in this case, I think we have to add to it, and that's why it's a marriage of Venice and Rome. We're not only talking about Venetian style, we're also talking about Roman reality. So, St. Peter's really is big. It really is. And so, Piranesi shows it as really big. But this is a reality which he's showing, not to the same scale as the reality, but the effect is very much. And likewise, you know, the Colosseum. It's big. It's big, you know. There's nothing in Venice like this. And so when Piranesi shows it, he shows it big. He uses the tricks of stage design and so forth, but he shows Roman reality. He transforms Roman reality. He also echoes Roman reality. Crucial point is that corresponding with his main subject for his entire life, the extraordinary quality and magnificence of Roman architecture, Piranesi emphasizes with his sense of magnificence in scale for every Roman building. And this enthusiasm leads to the creative distortion, if you will, which we have to think of in terms of also 20th century distortion. I always loved the story of Matisse. You know, he's in his studio, woman comes in, looks at the painting on the easel, says, "But Monsieur Matisse, that doesn't look like a woman." And he says, "My dear lady, it is not a woman, it is a painting of a woman." So, and this is also the distortion which led Goethe to be so disappointed when he traveled to Rome in the later 18th century, and he said, well, Rome, this stuff is really, it's not nearly as interesting as it was in Piranesi's prints. Okay, in the context of Roman prints and illustrated books on architecture and archaeology, vedute and so forth, I want to talk about another aspect, this is number 3, which is Piranesi's freedom of treatment, his freedom of design. He's finding not just the right point of view, he's also creating a right point of view. And Piranesi's practice, throughout his life, he continued to make architectural fantasies, all the way until he died. He didn't just do it early, he did it all the way through. And he did views throughout his life. And my thesis is that he brings together these two, an intricate interaction between his fantasies and his views. And that's what makes him so free and creative in his design of his views. Now, in much of European art, including Roman art, there's a long tradition of capricci, or architectural fantasies, and a long tradition of views. Both of them go back to the 15th century. However, in Roman printmaking, there's almost no interaction between the two. You've got a capriccio, a fantasy, or you've got a view, one or the other. That is encapsulated in the title page of Canaletto's series, Vedute esate o ideate. So you have views which are real views, or views which are fantasies. As late as that, 1744, this kind of distinction is going on, but bang, it ends very quickly in the early 1740s. The best example in Roman art for this interaction between capricci and vedute is not in printmaking, but in painting, and in fact is Panini. So you got a really good example on view now. Here's another one. Panini will take various buildings out of different places in Rome and put them together into a kind of forum like that. Usually he does it as a setting for some antique subject, like Paul preaching in Athens. So he takes a bunch of buildings, you know, puts them together to make a kind of imaginary Athens. But once again, I think if we look to Venetian art, we see a much more serious tradition of this interaction, especially with Calaveras and Canaletto. And with Calaveras, you see, he's much more radical than Panini. He takes an arch out of the middle of Rome and he puts it on a seashore, you know, and then he puts the Mausoleum of Hadrian there in the background, and there's an obelisk, you know. This is sort of, you know, pick and choose, almost do it by numbers. And really, for me, my favorite is Canaletto. So here's a view of Venice, the Rialto Bridge in Venice, and everything in the picture is right except for the Rialto Bridge. The Rialto Bridge is Palladio's design for the Rialto Bridge, not the 17th century bridge that was actually built. This was Palladio's design, which was never built. So Canaletto does him the honor of building his bridge. This is the design transformed into the reality of paint, the way it would look crossing, the Grand Canal, but set into a context which is very real. It's just this is what would have happened had his bridge been built instead. Or, even better, one of my very favorites, here's Venice again, and Canaletto has given us the Grand Canal, and he's given us the buildings that are appropriate on the left and right, and there's Palladio's bridge, which was never built, instead of Longhina's. And then he gets another idea. Why don't we take the Basilica, the great Palladian building from Vicenza, and just move it to Venice? As if some huge military helicopter could pick it up, transport it, and plunk it down right there on the Riva. Nice idea. So this kind of easygoing movement back and forth between fantasy and reality in pure capricci or quasi-capricci or partial capricci, is I think what really is the key to Piranesi. So, for example, in the Prima Parte, he did a plate called the Galleria Grande. All right, magnificent space, wonderful blah. Anybody would say, this looks like he's been looking at St. Peter's. Yes, it does. It looks like it's a fantasy inspired by the spaces inside St. Peter's. But then, this is 43, 5 years later, when he comes to do an interior of St. Peter's, he's inspired by his own fantasy. You see what I'm talking about, this interaction. Another example, here's a Bibbiena fantasy forum, from a 1740 publication. I'm trying to be very careful all these dates work. I'm not showing you something after Piranesi, but before Piranesi, just before Piranesi. Piranesi then transforms that into a more elaborate forum with staircases and so forth. And then, this is 43. In 48, again 5 years later, when he comes to do the Piazza del Popolo, he bases his distortions on his own fantasy forum as he locates the obelisk, as he moves the two churches farther apart, as he makes their domes much higher than they actually are, makes it a much clearer context. You can actually see the layout, the topography of the Piazza del Popolo in a way you cannot if you're standing there. And the same thing happens with the more radical fantasies like the Cartry. So there's plate 15, my favorite in the first edition, 1750. 20 years later, 20 years, it's in his brain, 20 years later when he comes to do the Villa of Hadrian at Tivoli, those kinds of arches and their echoing and their contrapposto and so forth is still in his head. So this is what I mean about the interaction between fantasy and reality, and that's, I think, one of the aspects that makes Piranesi great. It's also one of the aspects why certain projects, when I first came to the gallery, a very good photographer named Herschel Levitt, whom I do admire, came to talk to me, and he wanted to do a book called Views of Rome Then and Now, and what he wanted to do was facing pages of Piranesi's views and his own views. And after he'd been in Rome for a couple of months, he wrote and said he couldn't find the right point of view. He kept looking for the right point of view to capture what Piranesi captured. Well, I think the answer is there was no such point of view. Piranesi made it work by stretching, elastically, compressing, moving, so that you got the spirit of Roman buildings. That's why Goethe was so disappointed. It wasn't just the scale, it's also the wonderful layout, the perspective which Piranesi gives you. Again, like Matisse. These prints, these are not Rome, these are etchings of Rome, right? Number 4. One of the ways in which Piranesi rises so far above the context of Roman architecture, Roman printmaking, on archaeology and so forth, is his sense of atmosphere, and also ability to create atmosphere and tonality, texture, light and textures. The way he attempts to capture and succeeds a lot of people attempt. Piranesi succeeded in capturing the variable light, the palpable atmosphere of air around these buildings. In his Roman Vedute, in his architectural prints, this is almost absent in the 16th century, 17th century, early 18th century. I don't even need to show you any examples. Take my word for it. It's not there. It begins really at the beginning of the 40s with Giuseppe Vazzi. I'll show you his two best. There's the Porta Angelica at sunset, and here's the Piazza Vaticana. And indeed, there is a certain variety in light and in atmosphere. You see it especially in the sky, nice clouds, and you see it on the ground, variations in texture and so forth. But what about the main subject? What about the buildings below the sky and above the ground? Almost no variation in texture, no variation in lighting, monotone, very even. And these are the best of Vazzi, but contrast the sunset on the left with Piranesi's sunset, with the Dioscuri, got a big blow-up of that in front of the exhibition, and the print itself is shown. I mean, here, the light, the sun set is much more clear than it was with those stupid rays, and the sense of variety in lighting on the figures, the carriages, the ruins, the buildings, and so forth, extraordinary. And yet, it's not just a conglomeration of lighting. You have the sense of the whole being pulled together by this kind of enveloping light, which brings all of the elements into a certain relationship to each other. Now, Piranesi's range in dealing with light and texture is clear. For example, here's his early St. Peter's, this wonderful silvery quality. I mean, those clouds that look like they're crushed taffeta, Or later, the Portico of Octavia, which you can just feel. It's in a kind of warm southern sun. It has that kind of warmth of sunlight. But absolutely simultaneously, 1760, the interior of the portico. Now we're in a really brilliant Roman sun, painful to the eyes. You almost have to cover your forehead. You can't quite see because the sun is so bright. So simultaneously, he makes these two, exterior and interior, showing two totally different types of light, like two totally different times of day, but both of them infected with this marvelous sense of texture. Look at all the different textures on those blocks of stone, brick, baked. You see the difference between baked brick and carved stone very, very clearly, very clearly. And Piranesi shows this throughout his views. Now here, of course, dare I say it, Piranesi's coming straight out of Venetian art, this sensitivity to light and texture and atmosphere, and also Venetian printmaking. So you get a guy in the 1720s like Antonio Faldoni, who picks up something from 17th century French printmaking, Mellon, and transforms it into a system, these close parallels, very careful parallels, which now give you a wonderfully soft, look how he shows this woman, this fantastic, she was a blue stocking, Louisa Vergara, she was a great poet, and women had a much higher status in Venice in the 18th century than they did in the 19th century, let me tell you. Anyway, he's shown her in this beautiful, soft light. He's created a system which creates a kind of light, and to oversimplify matters, that kind of parallel hatching, then Canaletto takes, and he puts a little tremble in the parallels. Those are all parallels in the sky and in the water down here, but he puts a little tremble, into the parallels, so it creates a kind of humid atmosphere. It's not the softest light, it's more palpable. It's more almost, you can almost touch it. And likewise then, Marieschi transforms this system by making the parallels short and long, close and far apart, to create a sense of all the staining on the side of the Basilica of San Marco. So you see how, you've got a system, you invent a system for a particular purpose, not just to be fancy, but for a particular purpose, which is successful, and then you get a succession of artists who vary that system for a similar purpose, but with a wider variety, and that's just what Piranesi does. Picks it up from these guys in the early 1740s, mid-1740s, takes it back to Rome, and transforms Roman subjects with this new sensitivity to light and atmosphere and texture. And of course, it has a long tradition in Venetian painting. I'm not even getting into that. We're just talking about the printmaking. Okay, so beyond contemporary Roman and Venetian art, for a larger context in the history of printmaking, we're still dealing with printmaking, and more unique to Piranesi, not really in Roman or Venetian printmaking, is what I would call his graphic creativity. His creativity in manipulating and using graphic techniques. So the variety and subtlety of his use of these parallel lines may be Venetian, but he creates brand new graphic techniques having to do with tonality, which have nothing to do with Venetian art, but which are for a very clear purpose, very much the same purpose. So here's one of the Cartri in the first edition, and here is his great view of the waterfall at Tivoli. And in both cases, he has used acid directly on the copper plate, not by means of a groove, but he's painted acid in the foreground. After doing the print, when you look at it carefully, you see the lines underneath. There's a couple walking in the foreground there and so forth. And he thought that that was not successful. And so he simply painted acid to hide it along the left margin and the bottom. And when he came to the waterfall at Tivoli, he wanted to show the particular way that the water not only looks nice and white when it's coming down like, Niagara Falls, and when it boils up at the bottom, but then what happens when you get this kind of mixture of mud and so forth? That's sulfur tint. Sulfur tint, which was used by Rembrandt in the middle of the 17th century to close up some of his cross-hatching to make it more unified tone. Where did Piranesi get it? Have no idea. How did he come to it again? Don't know. People don't use it after Rembrandt. It's very dangerous. Sulfur tint frequently is flowers of sulfur dissolved in oil, and there's just enough humidity, just enough water in the oil to let the flowers of sulfur convert into sulfuric acid. You get a little sulfuric acid which bites the copper plate directly without any intermediary. Interesting, isn't it? And it's sort of like, the stories about Picasso. So he goes to lunch, and they have fish, and he eats the fish, and then he takes the bones and he makes a plate. So whatever's around him, he picks up. I'll show you another good example. Here's something. Sometimes when I was describing these techniques in my catalog raisonné, there was no technology. There's no discussion in Bossa or any of the standard books on printmaking and what this is. Piranesi invented. I did invent some. My least favorite words that I came up with was ink dabbing, which is terrible. It's really not a very good. But here he is. We've got the title plate to the Cartri, 1750. All right. And so during the 1750s, towards the end of the 50s, 57, 58, he's beginning to think that it needs a little strength here and there. So what does he do? He inks the plate, he wipes the plate, and then with his thumb or his palm, I've actually found the fingerprints, he puts a little shmoosh, sorry to use a technical term, but he shmooshes a little ink, onto the wiped copper plate. So there's a nice shmoosh there where he thinks, and then there's more up here on the underneath of the arch. He thinks the underneath of that arch should be a little bit darker. But he doesn't do it once, like Rembrandt or Kirchner. He does it for a whole edition. So he knows what he needs to do, but rather than actually changing the copper plate, he makes, I don't know, a dozen or 20 impressions, a dozen or 20 editions, all 14, and he just does it. It's easier. He just does it with his thumb or his palm. So you have a whole edition of the cartridge with these additions, which are done by hand. Okay? Or one of the ones which took me a long time to actually see what was going on is what I had to call, for want of a better word, scratching. Don't know what he used. Some primitive form of sandpaper, carborundum stone, I don't know, wire brush maybe. But if you look carefully, this early print from the Prima Parte, 1743, if you focus on this basin here with the water overflowing, okay, behind the guy and to the left and right of the water, it's a little gray. Well, that gray is because when he finished the copper plate, he took whatever was, here on the table, and he scratched it a little bit because he thought that that basin needed to be a little bit darker. Of course, that scratching is incredibly delicate, more delicate than dry point, so it wears out right away. It wasn't a very good technique to keep going, but he did it, and he made it work. And then, for me, the most amazing of all of the cartridge, this plate 15 from the first edition, he layers these techniques. Okay, he's sort of playing around like Picasso in the studio, but he's playing around with a very clear intention. And so he blocks in the arches and the forms, and then he comes in with his acid, probably sulfur tint, and he paints it on the plate. Just paints it, and then he burnishes so that the forms don't get lost. So there's burnishing marks, at the edge of that arch, so you don't forget where you are with the architecture, whereas the interior now, the spandrel, as it were, of the arch is still covered with that sulfur tint, that tonality. And then he puts in acid again, second go-around, like a painter, right? He's doing layers. So again, he goes in with the acid, and he puts it particularly strongly in certain places, like on the foreground base and so forth, and then he burnishes again, building up texture and tone, so that what's the result? Well, the result is these magnificent, giant, monumental arches are infected with a palpable atmosphere, both on the surfaces of the stone and also between the arches and beyond the arches. It's an impossible space. It doesn't work. You can't draw it, People are foolish who try to draw this as an architectural space. He's looking at it as these wonderful arches with an interior space which is boiling around them, like that very first drawing I showed. Fantastic. And, the guy who got it right, who understood but got it totally wrong, was his teacher, Giuseppe Vasi, who after Piranesi worked with him for a couple of years in the early 1740s, said, "You're too much of a painter to be a printmaker." Aha. No, he's so much a painter that he makes a great printmaker. Not tidy like Vasi with everything in its right place, but with things open and moving and circulating and so forth. Even more distinctive of Piranesi's graphic creativity, and this was my main scholarly work in the 70s and 80s. Very hard to show in slides, but Piranesi developed, you got to talk about this if you're going to talk about Piranesi. Piranesi developed techniques to transform images from his plates, both through changes on the copper plate and also through changes in the way they were printed. Okay, so now he's really encompassing the kind of Rembrandt aspects of printmaking. And so he alters the states of his copper plates. This is the famous example, plate 7 from the cartridge in the first edition, the second edition. It's on view in the exhibition, thank God. I didn't choose the slides because I knew that, but it was very clever of Susie to put those in. So he changes, he puts in all sorts of more elements, more bridges, more ropes, more spaces up there. All that's very clear. That's old hat, known since the beginning of the 20th century. What wasn't known was that besides changing the states of the copper plate, he also changes the color of the ink that he uses for the same states. Okay? So here's on the right a very early impression of the second edition, printed in 1761. There's an impression printed in the 1770s. We've moved from a kind of warm, sepia-toned printing ink to a solid black ink. And the image then is transformed only by the color. You get much more projection, you get much more depth, you get much more isolation of different elements. Here you've got this wonderful, soft, warm Roman sun. There you've got that harsh Roman sun, what I was talking about with the Portico of Octavia. And besides changing the appearance of the plates through changing the color of the ink, he also changes the amount of the ink that he leaves on the wiped copper plates. So there's 1756, warm, carefully wiped. 1770s, black, more ink left on the plate. Now the sense of monumentality of those tools, these are just tools, these are not buildings, but the sense of power, the sense of stuff, mass, is transformed by the way he changes the inking. There's no change in the states of these plates. The change is in the printing. So Piranesi, he coordinates his development of new images. His style changes. He moves from tonality to mass to surface details as he goes from the 50s, 60s, 70s. But he also transforms the way he prints his old copper plates. Okay? So he transforms the matrices not just by adding new lines to them, but also changing the way that he printed them. And he does this not just for experimenting, a la Rembrandt or Kirchner, but he does it as a standard technique for printing entire editions. So he's transformed. Think of a painter, okay? Think of a Picasso, any painter, who paints new images. And so he changes his interest, subject matter, style, and so forth, as he paints new images. Over the course of 20, 30 years, changes it radically. Now think of the same painter who not only paints new images, but goes back and repaints all the old images. Keeps the same forms, but changes the edges, changes the texture, changes the colors, the amount of color, and so forth. That's what Piranesi does. That's the glory of printmaking, that he can not only change the matrices, he can also change the way the matrices are used. Now we're really getting very far into what makes Piranesi a great artist. We're still at the point of what makes Piranesi a great printmaker. We're going to try now two things which make him a great artist beyond printmaking. Beyond the history of printmaking and beyond any Rome and Venice stuff, quite original with Piranesi, I think, was his sensitivity to and his ability to create in images an extraordinary sense of the mass of architectural elements. This is something, believe me, doesn't exist in Rome, doesn't exist in Venice before Piranesi. Doesn't exist, as far as I know, anywhere in any art before Piranesi. Now, some scholars speculate that maybe his sense of architectural mass depended upon his childhood upbringing in Venice, not Venetian art, but his upbringing. His father, Matteo Lucchesi, was an architect of the Venetian waterworks. So maybe Piranesi went out with him onto those giant breakwaters, saw these huge blocks of stone that try to keep the Adriatic at bay and so forth. Maybe, we don't really know. It's a reasonable speculation. But if it came from his Venetian experience, it came from his Venetian life, not Venetian art. And what we do know is that Piranesi, when he gets to Rome for the second time, and he starts to work on his great book on Roman antiquities, one of the very first things that he wants to pay attention to is Venetian waterworks. The sewer. The sewer? Who wants to work on the sewer? How about the Temple of Saturn or something like that? No, the sewer system, the aqueducts, how the water gets there and how the water leaves. That's very important, Piranesi thinks. So He starts off with things like that, and then this is one of the plates, thank God, Susie put on view upstairs, from the Della Magnificenza. It's the Emissario of Lago Albano, so Piranesi, just to sort of spring forward here, he's wondering, he's out there working because the Pope lives out there, so he's going out there for patronage reasons. But he's interested in the lake of Albano, Lago Albano. What happens? It's an enclosed lake. There's springs feeding into it and so forth. But what happens in the rainy season? Where does the water go? It doesn't overflow the banks. So what does Piranesi do? Well, he looks around. He walks around the edge of the lake and so forth. He notices this little thing. I think that's it there. Can't quite see it clearly from my angle. And he wonders whether could there be a way to get the water out of the lake when it got too high. And on the other side of the mountain, there's a fountain, what the Romans call a fountain, which was always thought to be a spring, underground spring. Piranesi says, the Romans, they were so good. Maybe they found a way to bore under the mountain, right? Under the mountain, so that when the water got above a certain level, it could go out into the valley. Interesting. But he's an empiricist, just like me. So he's not just going to say maybe, and he's not reading it in any ancient text. No. So what he does, and this is the frightening part of empiricism, of course, before the age of diving bells and so forth, he hires a boy, a very good swimmer. Okay? So Piranesi's theory is that if this, what he thinks is an entrance to an underground waterway, if the Romans did bore a hole all the way under the mountain, at a certain point there would have to be a hole coming down for air, right? Because you'd have a kind of Venturi suction effect if there was no air coming in at various things. So his idea, if the boy swims and holds his breath far enough, he will come to an opening which goes up. It's all grown over now. Plants, trees, there's no indication of any hole on the surface of the mountain. But this is his theory. So the idea is the boy dives in, and he swims, and he comes back, and he swims farther, and he holds his breath longer and longer until he came to one of those air shafts. And there he could breathe again. And then he could swim further or swim back. Very much, the evidence of facts. Not just reading Vitruvius and speculating, but the evidence of facts. So, Piranesi then gets interested, how did they build these things? How did they build the tomb of Cecilia Metella or the mausoleum of Hadrian? We're talking about big stones. We're talking about, 15, 20, 35, 40 feet above the surface of the ground. How do you get those stones up there? In the 1st century AD? So he notices some things on the stones nobody else had noticed. He sees that there were some places where there was a little rough area on the outside or the inside of the stone wall. And then he sees these strange holes in some of the stones which have been dislodged. And so he comes up with a whole theory that they used grappling hooks, iron hooks like this, and those hooks went under the edges of those protrusions. But of course, if you try to lift a stone with just those two hooks hooked together like that, the thing is going to careen back and forth like this. So that's what those rough areas were for. There was actually a protrusion. So when they carved the stone block, they left a little neck coming out so that a rope could be passed around the neck and under the iron hooks and then pulled up by a pulley. Neat, eh? Very neat. Comes from looking in great, great detail at what's the actual surface and then asking yourself the question, how in the world did they do this? And then not going to all the ancient texts. Yes, of course, you read the text, maybe they answer it, but they don't really answer it. So then you've got to figure out from the material itself how it's done. So for Piranesi, it's the foundations. The real glory of Roman architecture begins at the bottom. Begins with the basement, begins with the Roman arch, right? The round arch, which gets used in ancient times in Roman building. That's the secret, not the lintel, the arch. And then how do you make those arches? What do you use them for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so for Piranesi then, this sense of mass, now he shows you the Mausoleum of Hadrian, and he uses all those tricks from Bibbiena, you know, the scene on an angle, scene from below, and so forth. But now all of that is to give you a sense of this gigantic quality of the structure, this heaviness, this mass, which he can make clear even when you see the same building from a distance. You know, you sense how really big this thing is, how heavy it is. And then that infects so many of his plates. There's the Forum of Nerva, you know, here's the Pantheon. You see what I'm talking about? This sense of mass, or even in the case of a fragment, like that corner of a temple. You sense not only the decoration, you get the size, the scale, and all of that, but you also get the incredible mass. Or he can take the same mass, and as it's so plumped down in the Pantheon, he can make it really soar, like this Baths of Caracalla. You see, he uses the arches to make that mass go up into the sky. I always think of a shot putter when I see this print. You know, that heavy thing moves up and out through the composition. Now, this kind of creation of power and mass in architecture, never before, and as far as I'm concerned, never really again, in artistic portrayals. So that's one of the things that make Piranesi great. Finally, I'm going to conclude with one last element, which makes Piranesi, for me, so different, so appealing, also in the context of the whole history of art. And that is related to his freedom of treatment in his fantasies and his views, but is slightly different because it has to do with the power and the brilliance of his compositions, and very much in terms of the geometry of his compositions. This is what first got me with Piranesi. I wasn't interested in the Roman views and so forth. I was interested in this amazing sense of composition that he had, that he could make these telling, powerful, immediately arresting compositions, regardless of what the material was that he was composing. So Piranesi transforms both Roman and Venetian art in portraying architecture and archaeology. And this, of course, has to do with his use of perspective, but also has to do with specific elements of his composition. So let's talk about geometry. And let's talk, the easiest thing is, first of all, we'll talk about repeating geometry. Repeating geometry, okay? So there's a Bibbiena print, and you see how the arches, you know, repeat each other, da, 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 all the way into the background, give you a sense of space, because the arches grow shorter and shorter and shorter, and so you're going farther and farther and farther. So that, again, is the background of North Italian stage design and Bibbiena. Piranesi develops these ideas. For example, here's Santa Costanza, the interior of Santa Costanza. So we're kind of riffing on Bibbiena, but in a way which is maybe more interesting because we're getting those arches that move off to the left and the right. So we're getting those arches in perspective, not just in frontal repetition, but also in perspective repetition. And he takes the same sort of geometric repetition to an amazing sense of depth. So here we're repeating the windows. You're walking down the street, and you see all these rectangles going away into infinity. The repetition carries your eye more and more and more. And one of my favorites, that aqueduct again. So you got those arches, one arch after another arch after another arch. Almost makes you can feel the water rushing through the aqueduct, you know, down from the mountain toward the city of Rome. Fantastic sense of motion. But besides repetition, Piranesi also uses geometry in contrast or contrapposto. So this has a longer tradition in Venice. Here's Marco Ricci. When you analyze it in terms of geometry, you're talking about convex arches set against concave round temples and concave urns. Ricci was great. Canaletto picked up on that. Used the convex arches to set off against a flat thing in the background. Squarish, flat building. Echoed then eventually by a triumphal arch off to the right. Fantasy. Piranesi picks this up. Well, first, this is Bibbiena. Here's Bibbiena. This is very clever in terms of geometry. So 1740, Giuseppe Galli Bibbiena, looking under an arch, looking under repeated arches, but now set off on angles against each other. So you get a much more active composition. And then, with our boy, he just takes that and he just, it's like, I don't know, Dizzy Gillespie. It's like, it's a jazz combo, and then suddenly the drummer or the sax or the trumpeter, I don't know, just takes you away. You see the background, you see what this is related to, but Jesus, talk about complicated, talk about, echoing, talk about contrapposto, talk about jazz, talk about Johann Sebastian Bach, and then everything with this air which moves around, the air which moves around inside and around and so forth and so forth and so forth. And this is then what led to his most influential print from the Prima Parte, 1743, the so-called Magnificent Bridge, where you look under a concave arch in the foreground, and you look onto a series of repeating arches going, along a diagonal, shades of Bibbiena, into the background. And then Piranesi says, no, not like Canaletto, not flat, not a building. No, we're going to echo the foreground arch with two background arches. So we'll close the composition by echoing the foreground. Clever. And this was the most influential print, probably, that Piranesi ever made. Gets repeated again and again by Hubert Robert, by Canaletto, by everybody who ever saw it, in different ways, and by Piranesi himself. And so Canaletto goes to London just after he sees Piranesi's print. Make a picture of London under the arch, And Piranesi himself, says, well, look, we can riff that further. So here's a view under an arch onto the Arch of Constantine. Nice, little echo. Or, we'll make it more complicated, Costanza. So we'll have, you see, it's the flip side. Arch, arch, angled arches in repetition. Neat, Neat. And even more complicated, here we go. Back to the Prima Parte, plate 15. Fantastic composition in terms of geometry, if you just draw the geometric lines, the way you must do here in the Yale School of Art, right? You have to do that. It's the Yale School of Architecture. So, centralized little open loggia, encircling grand staircase, which is echoed upside down by an encircling coffered ceiling. So we've got a round central thing, which is then you get the roundness reinforced. We're moving around that until we come to this transverse loggia in the background. Fantastic. And Piranesi thought it was pretty good. So when he came to do the Cartry plate 3, same centralized element. Well, not closed, not open. Here comes the spiraling staircase going around it. But now, instead of making the ceiling, echo in reverse or upside down, that spiraling staircase, now it's like a fireworks explosion. It goes up and out, going around that central thing, and then we're just floating up, like the baths of Caracalla, into the sky and out. Very complicated. So, this kind of geometric composition, of course, comes to a head above all in the Cartry. That's where he's really, in the 20th century, most well known. most misinterpreted by, well, already in the 18th century by Coleridge and other Quincy Adams, and so, I mean, they all misinterpreted Piranesi. They thought he was talking about bad dreams. Same thing with Huxley and 20th century existentialist Sartre. All these people who commented on Piranesi's culture, they thought he was talking about bad dreams. They even thought, that he was in a fever. These were fantasies from a fever. A fevered delirium is what Coleridge says. And Huxley says things like hopelessness, prisons of the mind, nonsense. In fact, in their first appearance, they were very much based on stage design. They come straight out of Bibbiena. So, Ferdinando Bibbiena designed a lot of prisons, carceri, because that's one of the standard elements of an opera. Not only Fidelio, but many others, you have to have a prison scene, as well as a royal courtyard and a palace interior and so forth. You need a prison. And so Piranesi then transforms those little prints into something magnificent and grand in his carceri. But those really don't have much to do with prisons, because there are no prisoners, there are no chains, there's no torture, there's none of that stuff. Indeed, these great, great open compositions, I mean, here there are people just, walking out of doors into a piazza. It looks like the Piazza Vaticana. There's the obelisk and so forth. So why did he call them prisons? Even, as he says, capricious inventions of prisons. I think it's because prisons were that aspect of stage design which needed the least decoration. You could do these big blocks of stone, you could do these big walls and so forth. He could have called them warehouses. They could have been, warehouses like the Fondaco de Tedeschi. They could have been, Venetian warehouses, but he called them prisons. And so they allowed him to create these fantastic interactive compositions of various geometrical forms in a way which let us focus on the geometry, let us focus on the composition, so we don't have to think so much about the human beings there, what they're doing, and so forth. And these then create something of such abstract power that I think, and I'm not the first, that they can be set side by side with some of the best works of modern art. So this wonderful plate 14 from the prisons in the first edition, 1948, Museum of Modern Art, Alfred Barr hangs this very print in this very state side by side with Picasso's Majoli. Title of the exhibition, Timeless Aspects of Modern Art, right? So in both of them, semi-abstract compositions based on multiple planes and angles, geometry, working together, working against each other, moderately dense textures through repeated short, straight lines, lively, moving architectural structures and spaces. Of course, I would give the palm, I love Picasso, and I love Picasso's analytic cubism, but I would give the palm to Piranesi, because I think he found a way to show us this kind of art, which is so much more clear. You need to learn the language of cubism. Most people have to work at it to learn. It is a language, as Picasso said, but most people have to work pretty hard to learn the language so you can actually see the woman playing the guitar. But for Piranesi, we see the stuff. It doesn't actually work. As you all know, if you've done any work on Piranesi, these structures are not capable of being built geometrically, because there are a lot of false perspective as well as evident perspective. But they look right. They feel right. We can work, we can see them, we can imagine them, and so forth. You have to learn the language on the left. The one on the right, anybody sees right away. They did. They saw it right away in his time and ever since. However, it is true that a dozen years later, Piranesi changed the cartouche. And he took a plate like the one on the left, and he added all sorts of new things. Lots of new bridges, lots of new elements, crisscross patterns and so forth. He also made the space much deeper. You go up several stories now, and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going up toward the sky. But the general effect is to make the print more dense. And because it's more dense with forms, it also looks darker. And so this let the Romantics go to town, you know. It's darker, it's heavier, blah, blah, blah. And most of the time, in fact, the people in the 18th century were seeing these later editions of the Cartry, not the earlier ones. So they, frankly, were deceived by the limited evidence that they had available to them. Now, in this later edition, we're getting some contrary elements to what I said about the first edition. And a plate, which comes at the very beginning after the title page, plate 2, is a brand new plate. And this is very striking because there's clearly torture going on here. There's a guy on the rack. So have these become prisons of the mind? Have they become, you know, have they been transformed from stage designs into, you know, terribly awful things? Well, you have to read them very carefully. The new plates, this plate and this area of this plate, contains a lot of inscriptions and bas-reliefs and portrait busts. And they refer very clearly to two different histories of ancient Rome. The one on the left to Tacitus, who talks very bluntly about Nero and what a lousy emperor he was and how terrible he was about, you know, treating his citizens. And many of the specific citizens mentioned by Tacitus are ennobled in these portrait busts up there. Their names are written below there, so we know exactly what Piranesi is talking about. And in one of the stories about Nero's dastardly deeds, it says that one of the more democratic Roman senators had a freedman, quasi-slave, who insulted one of Nero's henchmen. And Nero's henchman was so irritated by this that he had the freedman tortured on the rack. So we've got the inscriptions that tell us we're talking about Tacitus. We've got an image that refers to specifically torture on the rack. And then if we look very carefully at the clothing that the people wear, we see that, in fact, these central figures are sculptures. They're not real human beings. Around up here, throughout the image, are human beings in contemporary 18th century clothing. But the central figures are monumental in size by comparison, and they're naked. So what we're talking about here is modern Romans in the 18th century rediscovering ancient Roman torture practices, in this case imperial, that is Emperor Nero, but in the case of the image on the right, during the Republic. And all of the references here are to the terrible aspect of Roman Republican virtue, which led Roman citizens to do anything for the city of Rome. So the most striking, of course, is Brutus, who, when he was consul, heard that his two sons had tried to bring back the Tarquins. They were traitors. So as consul, he was forced to sit in judgment and preside over the beheading of his two sons. There they are right there. So what we get with Piranesi then, in these two plates, as he transformed the Cartry, is the sense of the dastardly situation under the empire with rulers like Nero, and the glory, if you will, of tough Roman Republican virtue, which could stand up. This is, you know, what's his name? Hand in the fire? Not Marcus Curtius, but the other one, yeah, who could go, you know, into the camp of the enemy, and in front of the invading general, thrust his hand into the fire and say, "There are 500 other Romans waiting for you." So that is what Piranesi did, and in my view, what he does basically is he takes that set of 14 Cartry, which were Venetian in our sense, you know, basically stage designs, and he makes them Roman. It was the only set which had nothing to do with Rome. So now the Cartry in the second edition are Roman. and we're looking at Roman prisons. They have nothing to do with Venetian prisons or contemporary Roman. These are fantasies of Roman prisons. Okay, that's for Piranesi being different and appealing. We step one more step back. What makes Piranesi a great universal artist? I would say, after studying Piranesi for 50 years, is that you have something to explain, whatever you think about greatness, not greatness, and so forth, qualitative judgments and all that. You've got to explain how is it that you have an artist who is so important for romantics, Thomas de Quincey, Coleridge, and the modern romantics like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Margaret Yourcenar, Aldous Huxley, and so forth, but also is so important for the, if you will, neoclassicists. So Louis Boulez, Robert Adam, I. M. Pei, for Christ's sake, in the National Gallery East building, straight out of plate 14 of the Cartier. So how can you have an artist who is so important for these two supposedly opposing forces in the history of art beginning in the late 18th century? Well, I think it's all the reasons above, and now people like Vasi, Canaletto, they're not even in the playing field here. We're in a bigger context. It's because, I think Piranesi balances amazingly his sense of endless space. So it doesn't matter whether you're inside or outside, you've got an endless space. You go on and on. And there's no limit, okay? That's romantic, of course. Endless possibilities. Thrusting outward, onward, upward, not into the dark, but into the light, And he balances that with an amazing sense of pattern, geometry, and order. We can see the geometry. We can see the order. Yeah, viewed from an angle, viewed from below, it's big, it's massive, it's going on and on and on, but we can see it, we can comprehend it. Now, it's not Renaissance geometry sitting heavy, like that on the ground. It's not the Ospedale dei Innocenti in Florence, It's something else, but it is available to the human brain to understand, to recognize. It's not confused. It's not chaos. Not at all. And it has to do with that, human recognition of pattern, echo, repeating, echoing, and then we see in Roman buildings, we see pattern, we see organization, we see structure. Even in the grandest of these buildings, we see what they were doing. And of course, those two, the balance between endlessness of space, recognition of pattern, and a sense of the efficacy of human endeavor. God, look what the Romans did. My God. This is where the existentialists go wrong. Piranesi is not interested at all in the futility of human endeavor and the enclosions of... No, he's very clear about the efficacy of human endeavor, including his own, of course, but particularly the Romans. And not only the ancient Romans, also the modern Romans. Look what the Romans did. And you combine those three, if you will, if I can go, out on a limb at the end, with a proper interpretation of the Cartier in praise of the magnificence of Roman antiquities, the architecture, but also the condemnation of Roman excesses under the empire, and the praise of Roman republican virtue. Those guys who built those waterworks, who did those giant stones, who managed to lift them up and make the tomb of Cecilia Metella or the mausoleum of Hadrian, those were the same guys who could put their hand in the fire. Those were the ones who were citizen soldiers. Those were the ones who believed in what they were doing. So, I would say, and we have to remember, Venice was a republic, right? It was not it was an aristocracy, but it was not a monarchy. It was not like the papacy. It was a republic. So you put all that together, and I'd say that you got with Piranesi the quintessential Enlightenment artist. Rather, I would like to hope in parallel with John Locke and David Hume in philosophy, and with Johann Sebastian Bach and George Frederick Handel in music. I think that's what makes Piranesi great.
Well, there's the Thomas Cole of the Civilization series in the Epitome. Did he, Thomas Cole, see? He must have seen Piranesi's works.
I think, frankly, Piranesi was so widely collected.
Andrew, I'm not sure if you're audible.
Piranesi was so widely collected, especially in the continent. That is, not only in Italy, but in Germany and in France and in England above all, also in the lowlands. Anybody who had contact with those cultures came in touch with Piranesi. In the American colonies, it's a little bit harder to say. I mean, there's good documentation and evidence of Piranesi having a real effect on art and literature in all of the major continental countries and the British Isles. Scotland, I think of, Robert Adam. The colonies are a little bit harder, but by the time of Thomas Cole, I would have no doubts. I mean, by the early 19th century, I think Piranesi was so well known that, and certainly anybody with any English orientation. Copley, absolutely, because he worked in England.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was a little troubled by one aspect of what you described contributed to his greatness.
Yep.
And it was your description of this empiricist bent of Piranesi, that it would seem to me that risking the life of a young boy in order to prove his theory suggests to me that an amazing amount of moral coarseness.
Could be.
So
He was not a nice man.
that was what my question would be, is not only not a nice man, but perhaps living a fantasy life, not
Maybe.
adhering to the rules.
I mean, I can tell you a story, for example, about his family, which was told by his son to his biographer in France, Francesco, his son, who went to Paris, at the end of the 18th century. And in the biography, which is based on Francesco's memories, Piranesi was so oriented towards architecture and towards Rome, and especially towards ancient Rome, that usually when he worked in his studio, he had students reading Tacitus or Livy or other ancient authors to him. And he worked hard, pretty obviously. I mean, this guy died at 58. And it's amazing what he accomplished in those years, from 43 to 58. And died at the age of 58 in 1778. So from 43 to 78, in those years was his working life. And Francesco says, which is not as violent as your particular question, but goes a little bit in the same direction. When they were at home as boys with their mother, Piranesi saw himself as so much of a paterfamilias that they were not allowed to eat supper until he got there. And he frequently worked late in the studio. So there is a certain element. I don't think I would particularly have liked Piranesi as a guy to have a beer with, I just think he's this amazing artist. But all the stories that we have about his practicing life, yes, there is the flip side. There is the Roman Republican side, When he goes at the end of his life down to see the temples of Paestum and make those drawings of Paestum and Pozzuoli and so forth, he already had a terrible fever, probably malaria, when they left Rome to go south. And his son and their companions were continually trying to get him to stay inside, to stay in bed, and he always refused. He said, I can't let down my Roman ancestors. And so he worked himself to death, very straightforwardly, refusing to give up with that kind of intensity. And I certainly don't apologize for his moral standards, not at all. It made this incredible artist. But we have to be a little bit clear too. I mean, he didn't actually kill anybody. Yeah, maybe he was going out on the edge to get this young swimmer to keep going, but he was pretty sure about his theory, and he's never known to have actually harmed anyone. He never got into a physical fight. He never got into a duel. He never, crossed swords with anyone. So his sense of intense personal psychological toughness and violence he didn't put into practice.
Yeah, thank you. It was an excellent lecture. I'm interested in what kind of preparatory work he did for his working on his compositions, and particularly with the idea that prints are backwards from what you draw. So if you could comment on that.
Okay, there's in his earliest life, so in the early 40s, when he's doing the prima parte, when he's doing the Cartry and so forth, through the 40s, he tended to prepare his images in pen and ink and wash drawings. And he would make usually small images. Only at the very beginning did he make images the same size as the copper plates. He left that behind, and he was able to make small compositions, and this has to do with his compositional thinking, which he could then blow up to 20 or 30 times their original size. The preparatory drawings for the Cartry are this tall, this wide, and the drawings are like this, so less than postcard size. So that's early in his life. As he moves into the 50s with archaeology and then with his views, he develops a new technique, which has never been published, so I'm giving it to you now. And that is he starts to work particularly with red chalk. Now, red chalk is very popular in the 18th century, particularly with French artists, because they can offset the red chalk onto another piece of paper. You can get a counterproof, so you get two images out of one, and then you can rework the counterproof. Piranesi used red chalk in a very different way. This is the Robesonian view, which I'll eventually make clear. That is that he made red chalk images roughly the same size, either details or whole compositions, as the finished prints. This begins about 1760. And then, this is the theory, they are in the same direction as the prints. Okay? I think what he did is he grounded the copper plate. When the ground was completely dry, he put the red chalk drawing upside down on top of the copper plate, ran it through the press, and he got a counterproof of the red chalk drawing on the copper plate, on the top of the actual ground. And then he could use that structure as his basic structure to needle through the ground to prepare the etching. And then he sort of finishes the etching and then take off the ground, ink it, wipe it, and then, of course, the print comes out in the opposite direction. That is the direction of the original red chalk drawing. Rather nice, eh? Clever guy. Any other questions? Thank you all. Sorry to go on so long.